Welcome to Crying Out Cloud, the podcast that will make you laugh, cry, and maybe reconsider all of your cloud security fears. I'm Eden. I'm here with my amazing co-host, Amitai. And today we have an awesome guest, a also returning guest, Scott Piper. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Scott is a principal cloud security researcher at Wiz. He is an awesome colleague of ours and very well-known figure in the cloud security community, often referred to as a cloud security historian. As a co-founder and former president of Forward CloudSec, Scott has contributed extensively to the field through tools like flaws.cloud, Cloud Mapper, and Parliament. His career spans leadership roles at companies like Block, along with running his consulting firm Summit Route. His work has shaped modern cloud security practices across Fortune 100 companies and global organizations. And we're super lucky to get to work with you. And everyone who is listening is super lucky to get to chime in and hear you on the pod today. So welcome.
Thanks.
I'd also say that his work shaped this podcast because he was one of our earliest guests.
Scott, where are you calling us from today?
I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah, as usual.
Amazing. So we have a very special episode for you today. We're going to talk about reInvent, key things to know, what came up, what's new, what's popping. But before we do, we have some important questions, mainly around Wiz's remarkable booth this year. That was a remake of Blockbuster. For those who that brings up a lot of nostalgic memories, but it was a security-inspired blockbuster. So I'd like to ask you, what was your favorite movie? Pulp Encryption, The DevOps Wears Prada, The Wizard of OS, or Saving Private Data?
I guess Saving Private Data would be the one I would most want to watch.
Oh, yeah. Amitai, what about you? What would be your pick?
That kind of sounds like Star Trek fan fiction, which I would watch.
Sign me up. I think like whenever I hear Blockbuster, I just remember that I never return my movies on time. So hopefully you fix your issues on time in your cloud environment. So we're going to talk about two parts. Before we go into the security aspects, and Scott will walk us through over the biggest security feature announcements, Amitai, can you just give us the TLDR of the big general announcements? What came out? What should be on everyone's radar if it isn't already?
So this part of the podcast is going to be like, for everybody who's interested in cloud security, it's going to be amazing. For people who are only interested in security, it's going to be really boring, but we got to get through it. So the Spark Notes version, which Eden just taught me what Spark Notes are, because I wasn't aware. I had never used that. First is Aurora DSQL, which is a multi-region serverless database, sort of like Google's Spanner, with the same availability as S3. So this might be considered one of their, I think, biggest announcements this year. Second was Nova, which is their new series of foundation genAI models. And you should definitely check those out if you're using Bedrock. And the third, I think, that was interesting is EKS Auto Mode, which is sort of like a secure by default, very like opinionated best practice EKS instance, which I think is a good thing all in all for security as well, because it lowers the chances of making mistakes just because it gives you less wiggle room, like just by virtue of having less buttons and toggles to click, you have less chance of making a security mistake. And that's that. Now anybody who is only interested in security can go back to listening.
I think it's worth pointing out though that for reInvent there were a lot of concerns going in. I think that it would be overwhelmingly genAI focused, and they had tons of other announcements. Like in my opinion, this was probably the strongest reInvent in years in terms of like things that I was interested in specifically, which is a lot of security things. So not only the security things, but a lot of other, major announcements as well. So I guess like there was genAI announcements, but there was tons of other announcements as well on top of all of it.
So would be really awesome. Scott, if you would give us first we're going back to Spark Notes, but just like what were the big key releases and announcements that security practitioners should be aware of, and then we'll dive into each one after that so they get all the details and the need to knows.
So there was RCPs, which is resource control policies, declarative policies, VPC public block access, and then centrally managed root access were kind of the top four security announcements. I think also it's worth pointing out, like, there is a series of announcements that come out leading up to reInvent and what is generally referred to as pre-invent. So between basically the start of November and now, there's been like over 500 announcements on AWS's What's New page. And so there's a ton of different things. People may have different opinions on what their favorite announcements were. There's a ton of announcements. It's interesting though, because it's not like wildly inflated versus the rest of the year. So throughout since January 1st, there's been like over 2,200 announcements. So basically there's like 23% of the announcements happened in the past month and a half ish. So it's not like wildly inflated, but it is obviously more than I guess would be the average.
If pre-invent is before reinvent, is there an after party to reinvent called invent?
There is not. No, I think after reInvent, everybody from AWS just relaxes finally. Like all their stress, they've been building up to this large event, and now they can actually enjoy the holidays, since probably during Thanksgiving, most of them were probably working nonstop trying to get their releases out and tested and everything done for that.
Cool. First one, RCPs. RCPs, resource control policies, which is like the resource version of an SCP. Tell us, are people going to take their SCPs and like turn them into RCPs, or do they serve a different purpose? How is one meant to use an RCP?
So they're separate things. So AWS organizations now has a number of different policies, like maybe 7 different types of policies associated with it. So you can have service control policies, which were the original ones. You have backup policies, AI opt-out policies, chatbot policies, these RCPs, declarative policies, and I'm probably missing some others that they have. But anyway, so it's another organization level policy, and similar to SCPs, where you can set these policies to govern how all of your accounts within your entire organization, or specific OUs or specific accounts individually, how they should act in some way. So you can set these policies associated with those different levels of organization, and it's going to impact the resources in that account as opposed to the principals. What's interesting here is that RCPs, because they're acting on resource policies, and resource policies impact things outside of your account, so principals outside of your account, it's a little interesting because historically with SCPs only impact your own principals. And so people might, have kind of a bad assumption where they think, okay, I want to have these backup files inside this S3 bucket and they're super important and I never want anybody to delete them. So I'm going to create an SCP that says nobody can run delete object on this S3 bucket. And that will impact your own principals in your account. But if, worst case scenario, an attacker gets admin access inside that account, a kind of loophole or bypass to the SCPs is they could modify the resource control policy to give their attacker-owned account access to that S3 bucket. And then because the SCP is not impacting that attacker's account, that attacker could then delete your backups. And so with RCPs, it is going to impact everybody, including people outside of that AWS account. And so it's useful for that purpose, but it's also very useful just for the perspective of you want to have policies that are impacting everything across all of your resources in your organization. And so this could be something as simple as I want everybody that accesses my S3 buckets to only use TLS version 1.3. And historically, if you wanted to try and enforce that, you had to add a statement to every single one of your S3 bucket policies and have to remember to do that, or you have to have like auto remediation that tags that, adds that statement onto the end of it. And so it just becomes awkward to try and do something like that. So now from a single place, you can add that statement, and now it's going to impact all of your resource policies. So it's good from that perspective. But then there's also a number of other like beneficial things that you can do very easily now. So for example, you want to say my S3 buckets. Or here's a better example. IAM roles. I only want AWS accounts within my organization to be able to access my IAM roles. That's very easy to do now. You can enforce that, and you can have some additional exceptions in there to say, you know what, I also use these other vendors, and so these vendors should be able to access my IAM roles as well. And so you can allow list some of those vendors there, and so that makes it very easy. And this is important because historically, if you wanted to give somebody the ability to create an IAM role and give them the ability to modify that IAM role as well, they could misconfigure it to allow anybody else in the world to access it, or they can misconfigure it to allow some vendor you don't want to have access it, or they could allow a shadow IT AWS account that's their own personal AWS account to access it in some way. And now you can prevent those things from happening. And again, similarly, historically you could try and use auto remediation to try and find and fix these things as quickly as possible, but now you can just ensure that they're fixed entirely. You can do some other cool things like if you want to allow GitHub Actions to access your IAM roles or various other vendors. Historically, there's been some misconfigurations you could make such that potentially any GitHub repo could access your GitHub action if you misconfigured things in the wrong way, I guess there. But now with RCPs, again, you can prevent that thing from happening. So I have a blog post that was published, I guess, 2 weeks ago or a week ago about this. So if you want to learn more about that, you can check that out for some of those examples. AWS has a great repo on data perimeters, which gives a lot of their authoritative policies on what you can do with RCPs. And this is super useful because there are some gotchas. Like things like, I think it's like load balancer logs use an AWS account. And so if you naively set your RCP to prevent various things from accessing your IAM roles, you could prevent one of those. You could basically break your logging. And so anyways, AWS's data perimeter repo has examples on how to do things the right way with like those gotchas taken into consideration.
So you mentioned before, like the GitHub OIDC misconfiguration, for example.
Yeah.
Like, would it make sense for Amazon to add those just by default to any new Amazon account, like any new AWS account?
So, okay, so a couple things to say on that. So one, like AWS has taken some action against that specific type of misconfiguration. So it is much more difficult to try to make a IAM role that's accessible to GitHub Actions that's like publicly to any GitHub action. So anyways, AWS has done some things there, but should AWS make these things default? Should they add in some of these additional security configurations? I think there's always like a pretty good case to be made for doing that type of thing. And AWS does oftentimes do that when they introduce new security features. They don't want to break existing accounts, but all new accounts will get some new feature. And I think part of the way in which AWS is maybe moving in this direction is with the declarative policies, which is another new feature that AWS has come out with, which gives you as an owner of an account or owner of an AWS organization more flexibility into determining when some of these things are going to get applied to your accounts.
Yeah.
Historically, AWS would say, hey, we're coming out with this new feature, and any new account that's made in the next, like after 3 months from now is going to have this auto enabled. Whereas, as as the security team, you may say, well, I just want it now. I want it on my accounts now. Or you may say, you know what, we need to do a whole bunch of testing. We need to modify things. So we actually need more time. And so declarative policies would give you more flexibility.
Yeah, just to double down declarative policies, so everyone's on the same page. They introduced these particularly for EC2. And it gives like security features around EC2, like enforcing IMDS like V2. But why, and you can maybe expand on it even more, but why do they limit this for EC2? And like, should other ones be getting this treatment, other resource
Uh,
types?
yeah. So it's not so I guess I should state that like the full name of declarative policies is declarative policies for EC2. And the API that you access for declarative policies is like declarative policies dash EC2 or something along those lines. So like it's very much so like even though it's been announced as declarative policies, behind the scenes it seems to be focused on EC2. And I think the reason for this is because they're like, hey, this is a cool concept. We should start using this. If we try and do it everywhere all at once, it's going to take us a long time to try to, get that deployed. So let's do like the minimum viable product. Let's focus on one service now, the one that seems to be most helpful for people. And implement it there. So that's my guess as to what's happened here. So I think as they expand this to other services, they may need to create new policy types of, declarative policies for S3, declarative policies for RDS or whatever it happens to be.
Okay, that takes us to our next one. VPC block public access. A way to ensure EC2s won't be publicly accessible. EC2s, again. It seems like it is intended to reduce the likelihood of an accidental misconfiguration, which super positive. Do you think it's effective enough for people to adopt it? Like, what should be the next step?
So I haven't played around with it, but the concept behind it is historically, one of the great things about the cloud and one of the horrible things about the cloud is that you can very easily spin up infrastructure, make things publicly accessible. In a day, you suddenly have a website that anybody in the world can access, and you don't have to talk to your firewall manager to open up ports or anything like that. And that's amazing. And it allows people to build quickly. But a number of enterprises don't really like the idea that any one of their engineers could very easily make something publicly accessible. And so AWS has, over the years added things like S3 public block access, and they now have a thing, AMI public block access, and ABS snapshot public block access, which are part of declarative policies. And so they've added in these capabilities to prevent people from being able to make things public. And VPCs and networking concepts have been a point of difficulty for doing something like that. And so historically, if you wanted to give your engineers the ability to use AWS, but not give them the ability to make an EC2 public, what you had to do was you had to set up a network for them in advance, play around with whether or not there's like NATs and internet gateways, basically set up this VPC for them. And then you had to use service control policies to prevent all networking related access for those people. And so this is kind of awkward, kind of limiting in some way and somewhat error prone as AWS comes out with like new services. Like for people that did this, there was a point in time when then AWS came out with uh it's not Direct Connect. There's some service I can't remember the name of it. Global Accelerator. And so when AWS came out with Global Accelerator, suddenly there was this way of bypassing that policy,
Yes.
basically. And so now AWS has this new feature that will basically allow you to very easily say, I want people to be able to use AWS to its fullest, except I don't want them to be able to make EC2s public or other types of networking resources like that.
Is it like a Boolean? Is it just like block or not? Or is it more granular than that?
There's a little bit of functionality there. You can say that you want to allow ingress only,
Mm.
you want to allow egress only, but not ingress, or you can disallow like all public networking of any sort as well. So that's my understanding. I haven't had enough time to play with it yet, though.
Okay, interesting. Let's talk a bit about another security feature called centrally managed root access. Let's talk a bit about how this works, about when you might use this, and if it's applicable for people who are already using AWS, or if it's mostly applicable for new accounts.
So yeah. So The root account has been problematic for people because ideally you want to have all access to your AWS accounts coming in through your identity provider, through SSO in some way. But the root access to the account uses an email address, oftentimes a shared password among your like DevOps team in some way, and they want that access, or they say they want that access because sometimes there are some things that only the root user can do inside an account. And so an example of this is if somebody makes an S3 bucket resource policy that's misconfigured in such a way that it basically denies all access, then nobody in the account can remove or fix that policy. And so you could have an outage. And so oftentimes DevOps teams are like, well, if the only way that I can fix a problem is through this thing, then I have to be able to have access to that thing. And people have tried to create various types of break glass mechanisms in order to give access to root access. So, for example, you can have an MFA device, and so people have tried to do interesting things with like one person has a password, one person has the MFA device code, and so you need two people. And
Sounds like a disaster.
it's awkward, or people say, okay, we're going to try to not have a password for this. And so if you need access, you can go through the basically password recovery flow in order to access the root user. And once you recover that password and use it, we ask that you please forget that password in some way. And so like it's always been awkward, like what people have tried to do for this. You can use service control policies as well to prevent it. And then, um, so anyways, like it hasn't really felt like there's been a good solution to this problem. And so this seems like now AWS has slowly over time, or more recently in recent years, removed many of the things that only the root user can do, and now they've brought it down to such a small number of things that now there's kind of two aspects of this centrally managed root access, and one of them is now you have way of centrally managing that root access, but in addition to that, you have specific actions that that root user can take. And so you want to say, hey, there's a problem in this account, somebody needs to fix it. We want to give you the ability to fix it, but not the ability to have full root access in that account. Because if we did that, and potentially you are malicious individual, or you're, for whatever reason, you could set up backdoors in the account. You could, exfil data from the account. You could do various other things. And so,
Or if you're
so
just clumsy.
yeah, exactly. Like there are many reasons why you want to try and limit this access still in some way. And so now with the centrally managed root access, you can now give people specific actions that they can take in the account without giving them full administrator access in it.
Is this something that, like, now that, first of all, it's interesting that it's only become available now, but now that it has become available, like, what does this require in terms of migrating an existing, setup, one of these little wonky setups to be able to leverage this?
One company in particular that I've had a lot of experience with in the past. They had a lot of AWS accounts, and they had service control policies to prevent root access, and they never had a need to remove that root policy. Like it just was so rare that people were going to make an S3 bucket policy or do one of the other things that actually requires root access in some way. And so they've been fine and happy, and for people like companies like that are just blocking off root access entirely and don't feel a need to ever really give anybody access, it may be acceptable for them to just continue with that strategy. For other companies that maybe have found themselves needing that root access more often, or having more of a fear that they may need to have that root access one day, and want to ensure as limited downtime as possible, they may want to investigate this feature in order to give themselves like that reduced risk of that root access when it's needed, but not take some of the other measures.
So it's not like a one size fits all thing that everybody's going to rush to implement. Like it's going to
Yeah.
be
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great thing. I think it's something that people will work towards eventually, but in my opinion, this isn't like as big a game changer as some of the other things. Like I think RCPs is something where like you should probably start investigating right now how to deploy those. It's awesome, gives you a ton of new you know much better governance.
And just kind of like zooming out, looking at all of these, like if you were getting inside the decision making room of Amazon and they chose to focus on these, improvements, all of these policies really seem to centralize how do we reduce the likelihood of an accidental misconfiguration. Do you think that's what they were thinking? Is like this the strategy behind it, which is to minimize your chances of going awry?
I think the general strategy is like better governance over these things, in the sense that these aren't one could argue that they're giving you some new capabilities, I guess, but like it's not like this is preventing a new risk that people didn't know existed before, or there was no solution to previously. Like there were always kind of solutions to these
Mhm.
things, even if they were maybe not as ideal as they could be. But now it makes it easier and it gives more central governance for this, so that you can say with greater certainty that this is like a rule that I have across my entire AWS organization of all of my accounts. I know that this is no longer a thing that I need to worry about because I have implemented it everywhere, and it's much more easy to like check and like identify whether or not you have implemented this everywhere. Whereas previously, you could do things with service control policies, but you had to basically make sure that like depending on how you were rolling these out, maybe that you were using SCPs and like on every account, and so you had to check certain statements, and it just became a little bit more awkward to do some of those things. Or with the resource policies, you had to make sure that the statements existed everywhere. So that this just kind of gives you better management of these things, I'd say.
Cleaner solutions, it feels.
It also seems like they put out a lot of new policy types this year as
Yes.
opposed to recent years.
Yeah, I think there's a greater focus in general on organization management. Um, I think it's interesting also that there are some companies out there that have hit the limits of organizations, and or for various other reasons they're required to have multiple organizations. And so I always wonder if we're going to have an organization of organizations or some other type of like higher tier of management concepts in some way. But yeah, I think it's great that they're recognizing that there are companies out there with thousands of accounts, tens of thousands of accounts. Like I know Amazon's retail business a number of years ago, they had a reInvent talk in which they mentioned that they had over 10,000 AWS accounts for like Amazon's own retail business. And so for a company like that, like you need ways of managing all those different accounts. And so this enables you to do that better. A lot of these new capabilities.
Let's say you could manifest whichever changes would be coming for next year. What would you like to see that maybe you wish you saw this year, expected to see this year, or just, hope to see in the future?
There are two very valuable things that declarative policies do that other types of policies do not do. One of them is it has an audit mode of sorts. And so you can basically identify whether or not this is going to impact your environment before you deploy these declarative policies. And so I think that for both RCPs and SCPs to have that audit mode or dry run mode, depending on what people want to call it, to basically identify like, am I going to have an outage if I try to do this thing? Like that would be very helpful to know in advance. And so
That would be very helpful to know in advance.
yes. So that is one thing, because you can try and figure it out. You can review your CloudTrail logs, you can look at Access Analyzer, like you can look at all these various places to try and see like what potentially the impact would be, and especially those CloudTrail logs. But it can be pretty complicated, and also complicated to understand. Have I formed this RCP in the way in which I expect it to? Like, is it applying the logic that I think it's going to be applying? And so it's always important when you're deploying SCPs or RCPs that you do thorough testing. You do a rolling deployment. Put these things, apply these first to like a test environment, and then your dev environment, staging environment, and then finally your production environment. probably want to break these things up so they're not all applying to all of your business units at once. You probably want to do like one business unit at a time, just so if you do have an outage that you have more like you're going to break less things at once. So that's one thing, is having that audit mode. And then the other thing that declarative policies do that's interesting is you can provide a custom error message when somebody bumps into one of these declarative policies. And so that's historically been a problem with service control policies is people get an access denied and they're like, but I'm an admin. Like, why can't I do this? I'm reviewing. And then, they start reviewing their IAM and reviewing other things. They're, like, okay, I have, the admin policy associated with my IAM role. Am I actually using that IAM role? It just becomes this massive troubleshooting to try and figure out what's going on because all you're getting is an access denied message and you're not getting any more input than that. Depending on the service and some things, you may get a little bit more information, like this is being denied because of a service control policy. But I think that, many enterprises, they would like to be able to tell people, hey, this is denied because of, our enterprise policy. If you want more information, go to this, Jira page, go to, this Slack room, something like that. You can ask for help. You can ask for an exception if you want, like to provide them more context and information on how to move forward and how to troubleshoot it better. So I think that those are kind of the most powerful things that occurred with declarative policies, that I hope get applied to the other policy types as well in the future.
You could also plant like bug bounty Easter eggs there.
That's like the issue as to why I've heard they don't want to give the custom error messages because, if somebody finds out that they ran into a service control policy or some other type of issue, then maybe they'll try their attack in a different way, or maybe it will give them enough context to understand why their attack didn't work and they should, try something different. Like, for example, if an attacker was trying to do crypto mining and they tried to spin up a whole bunch of EC2s and they chose the most expensive EC2s and they got an error message back saying like, hey, you're not allowed to use the most expensive EC2, use this other EC2 instead. Now the attacker is just going to continue their attack, but it just
So like call this number and to request
exactly. So there's been like OPSEC concerns, I guess, for the error messages. Personally, I'm of the belief that like the troubleshooting, the engineer pain that you potentially cause, the potential for outages and the delay in people trying to recover from the outage because they don't understand what's going on. I think that those benefits outweigh the risks, to give more context as to why you've bumped into an issue.
Well, this was rad and such a fascinating debrief of the big news from reInvent. First of all, if you want more detail, read Scott's blog post. And thank you, Scott, for taking us through this. It is awesome, as always, to have you on the pod, and we hope you'll come back for even more.
Definitely. Thanks for having me again.
Third time is the charm. Second time isn't the charm. Just in case you're wondering. This isn't the charm.
If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe and share a link to the podcast, but not your cloud keys. And as always, if your cloud security strategy is making you cry, don't worry, just cry out cloud.